Yeah, and I
So
kind
yeah,
of I wanted to get into that a little bit too, like the whole concept of just like, well, I mean, you said in your announcement that you've been wanting to do this since you were at least in high school,
yeah,
and like, and it just kind of like made me think like, all right, we're butt up against our 40s, and so that's a good you're
yeah,
talking
man.
about 20 some years. What like I guess it had me thinking about like communities and what like kind of keeps you attached to something for so long, because on like a weird kind of almost cliche tip, I've been really paying attention to NFTs and just like this whole thing. I just want to understand
Yeah.
what's happening, and it's wild, but like there's this intersect that's happening with like trends and communities, and like and I'm seeing all these people that are kind of like involving themselves in it, but then also people who have always been kind of waiting for this type of thing to take place so that they could be involved in it. And I feel like there's like a couple buckets that people like exist in. And one is like they admire from a distance and have like this casual appreciation for something they think is cool. And then the other is there's like they see an opportunity. Somehow there's like an opportunity to be like, taken advantage of, and or they're just personally invested in the actual underlying community that comes along with whatever that thing is. So like, what is it about skating, and what is it about like that community that's like kept you so involved in it and so passionate about it for all this, like this entire time?
I mean, definitely, it all kind of comes back to the sort of DIY ethos from our, punk rock skateboarding youth. That was, excuse me, that was instilled so hard that it informed the way that I've done everything for the rest of my life. You know what I mean? So like, it's so ingrained in my thinking that there was no way not to stay involved with it, even though I don't skate nearly as much as I did. And when I do, I like old man skate now. You know what I mean? I'm not going off the ground at all. So like, I don't know. I'm not an amazing skateboarder, but just something about that DIY ethos has always resonated with me. And from the concert side of things, live music, to solo art shows and all of it, all the underlying theme amongst all of it is like, do it yourself, get up and go, don't wait for somebody else. And that's embedded in skateboarding.
Right. Well, and then kind of to exactly what you're saying, like one of the things that I realized is like there are so many aspects that make up a community. And you touched on it right away when you basically said like the DIY thing, which is basically like the valued skill sets that like exist in a community, but they have their own culture, they have their own language, they have their own fashion. Like, when I think of skateboarding, I think of DC shoes. When I think of valued skill sets, like obviously like there's like some athleticism and like balance involved, but also like like just being able to like work with your hands. You have a physical thing that you need to take care of: wheels, trucks, boards.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, there's just, so that you kind of you got my like wheels spinning into like the skateboarding community as soon as, oh yeah, pun not intended, but God, that worked. But yeah, as soon as you said that we should do an episode, I really started like digging back into that concept of skateboarding, and like coming to that realization that it's got a long history. Like I've known about skateboarding since I was little, and it was because like my
Yeah.
next door neighbors were always skating.
And when you and I were teenagers, that was sort of like the resurgence of it, because it did pretty much die for a while. When we were super young, or right before we were born, it did kind of die off from its like peak in the late 70s into the early 80s. So we were kind of right on that second wave, like Tony Hawk generation or whatever. But yeah, I mean, just thinking about how it all connected, like you and I met through, shows that were as DIY as they could possibly be, what I mean? And like that sort of spirit definitely carried over into the way I approach live music as, as an adult. And I think it's just like, I don't know, it's such a real community when there's people actually like, again, not waiting for somebody else to do it, not waiting for the corporate giant to book the bands or whatever, just get up and go. I've always loved it,
Well, I guess like
skating.
Say again.
I said, and it permeates into skating. I mean, that whole skate and live music culture, they were one and the same to me, and to a lot of people, obviously. How many bands got launched by Tony Hawk Pro Skater?
Right.
How many older bands had like a second wave of new fans from Tony Hawk Pro Skater? Like a bunch of 14-year-old kids found out who the Dead Kennedys were. You know what I mean? Like that's amazing.
Yeah, and that's kind of funny that you brought that up, because I do remember like all those games, like Tony Hawk, like Cool Borders, just like the X Games game in general, like all their soundtracks like stopped just being like those little like 8-bit whatever, like boop 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 boop, and it was like real songs and real bands and like
and actual songs and bands that actual skateboarders would listen to. It made it really authentic, and gave those bands a platform that they never would have had otherwise. You know what I mean? It was like a especially like Goldfinger, they're like a ska band, they're like a subgenre of a subgenre, and one that was never taken very seriously at that. But I mean, they had a career because of their song being on that video game. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, so like the craziest thing for me, and I'm actually just realizing this in this moment, that I like my favorite MXPX song I heard from one of those games. It was Party at My House, Be There. And then fast forward like 10, 15 years or however long it took, then I ended up being on tour with them.
Yeah.
Like how
moments like that too. With like the very first band that I ever saw in a club, which was Club Laga, was Suicide Machines with Anti-Flag. And then years later, working at the Rex, there was a moment where we had booked both of those bands, and I was, walking through the green room, seeing them in there, and just thinking, like, man, 15-year-old me would be so pumped right now. It felt like very full circle, and like I had actually accomplished something, at least something that teenage Pierce would be proud of,
Yeah,
and that's important, I think,